On the 1st of September 1939, Germany invaded Poland, beginning the start of the Second World War. Adolf Hitler had gambled once again that Britain and France were bluffing. The German troops surged into Poland, crossing the border, attacking units, taking out bunkers. The tanks cut through the Polish defences. Hitler's new panzer divisions moved quickly and fast and cut straight through the heart of Poland. The tanks could get so quickly into Polish territory they were able to surround entire Polish units, effectively neutralising them. They were also supported by the devastating Stuka dive bombers. The Stuka, with its familiar siren, could dive down and drop bombs with pinpoint accuracy, destroying Polish targets and Polish tanks. The Polish air defences were no match for the newly formed Luftwaffe. Their planes were superior, their pilots were superior. The Poles relied on outdated technology and outdated aircraft. Control of the air was key, and the Germans soon had full air superiority. The advance of the German army was astonishing. This was much different to World War I. This was a new type of mobile warfare. The Germans called it Blitzkrieg. The Polish army were brave, but they were no match for the speed and ferocity of the German assault. Hitler had also done a deal with Stalin and Russia. When they attacked Poland from the west, the Russians would also attack Poland from the east. Poland and their army would be effectively crushed between the Russians and the Germans. The Polish army was still using horses and carts. They were effectively fighting a World War I battle, but the German army was more motorised, faster and better equipped. The smallest German tank was the Panzer Mark I, and it was nothing more than really a command vehicle. It was small. It was about 4 metres long and 2 metres wide, with two 7.92mm guns. Its armour was pretty weak, ranging between 7 to 13mm. In fact, apart from taking on infantry, this tank was pretty useless on the battlefield at the start of the war. However, during the Polish campaign, the Germans had 973 Panzer I tanks. Next was the Panzer Mark II, a vastly superior tank to the Panzer I. At the start of the Polish campaign, the Germans had 1,127 Panzer II tanks. The Panzer II was only slightly bigger than the Panzer I. The armour too was slightly more impressive at 15mm. At the start of the war, the Panzer II was Germany's most numerous tank. It was also the first tank they built with a proper cannon. Although it was small, it was vastly superior to the Panzer I in terms of main armament. But like the Panzer I, it was also fitted with a 7.92mm machine gun as well. The tank was pretty small and only had a crew of 3, a driver, a gunner and a commander. The Panzer II had a top speed of 24 miles per hour. It was with tanks like the Panzer II that the German army spearheaded its Blitzkrieg in Poland. These tanks got behind enemy lines and caused chaos. At the start of the Second World War, the Panzer III was Germany's best battle tank. The Panzer III could be upgraded, but the early models were fitted with a 37mm gun. It was also fitted with two 7.92mm machine guns. Unlike the Panzer I and the Panzer II, the Panzer III was designed to take on other tanks. The tank was 2 meters wide and over 5 meters long. It also had a top off-road speed of 25 miles per hour. The tank had a crew of 5, including the commander, the loader, the gunner, the driver, and the radio operator. The Panzer III was a good tank, but some of the French and British tanks had superior armour. However, the Panzer III could be upgraded with better armour and a better weapon. However, the Panzer III was more than a match for any Polish tank. Despite the effectiveness of the Panzer III, the German army only had 87 of the tanks in the Polish campaign. The most impressive German tank was the Panzer IV. It was the largest and it had the biggest turret. Despite its impressive size, it was only fitted with a short-barreled, high-explosive cannon, which meant it was used basically to take on infantry. Despite being almost 3 meters wide and almost 6 meters long, the Panzer IV was the biggest tank the Germans had, but it was fitted with a short-barreled gun, which meant it was really designed to fire high-explosive shells. The Panzer IV would be the only tank used in the Polish campaign that would survive the entire war. Later on, it was fitted with a much longer 75mm gun and thicker armour. After invading Czechoslovakia, the Germans discovered a great surprise. The Czechs had a superb tank, the 38T. The Germans took the tank and used it in the Polish campaign. It had an excellent 37mm gun and two 7.92mm machine guns. It also had good armour. In some places, the armour plating was 30mm thick, a vast improvement on the earlier Panzer tanks. Not only was the tank well armed, it was well armoured. And on top of all that, it had a top road speed of 42 miles per hour, making this one of the top German tanks. Over time, with upgrades, the Panzer IV and Panzer III would become superior tanks. But until then, the 38T was a great tank for Germany, and one of the best tanks at the start of the war. 55 of these tanks would be used in the invasion of Poland. As the German panzer divisions cut into Poland, the Russians attacked at the same time from the east, capturing many Polish soldiers and executing them. Hitler had gambled the British would never declare war against the Germans, because if they did, they may have to fight the Russians too. Contrary to popular belief, the Germans didn't have all the best tanks. In fact, the 7TP tank was a fantastic tank for Poland, and it fought valiantly during the invasion. With its 37mm gun, it was more than a match for the Panzer I and II, and could easily destroy them. It was also armed with a 7.92 machine gun, and had a top speed of 23 miles per hour. The tank was just over 4 meters long and 2 meters wide, and it was one of the best tanks that Poland had. During a Polish counteroffensive, these tanks destroyed a number of German panzers. Unfortunately, 2 of the tanks were destroyed and 6 were disabled, and the Poles just didn't have enough to change the outcome of the war. In one battle, these Polish tanks held off the German counterattack, and the Polish infantry, thanks to these tanks, were able to drive the Germans back, but only for a short time. As well as a number of tanks, the Polish army also had armoured tracked infantry support vehicles. These machines may have had tracks like a tank, but instead of a turret with a gun, they had machine guns instead to support the infantry. They also had tankettes, other tracked vehicles, which didn't have a main gun, but machine guns, like the TK3. At the start of the Second World War, the German fighter was the Bf-109. It was the smallest and fastest and most agile fighter the Germans had. The Bf-109 would become the backbone of the German Air Force, lasting throughout the entire war. Over the course of the war, it would have many upgrades, and there would be many different variants of it. The plane would be given a more powerful engine, better weapons, and it would improve throughout the Second World War. But at the start, in 1939, this was one of the most feared fighters in the world, and one of the most advanced. The plane was almost 9 meters long with a speed of 330 miles per hour. Early versions of the plane had 2 7.92mm machine guns fitted into the wings. Later versions had 2 7.92mm machine guns fitted into the actual nose housing of the plane itself, and also a cannon fitted in the centre of the propeller. The Polish Air Force was outdated and had no plane that could match the Bf-109. The 2 main Polish fighters were the PZL P7 and the PZL P11. These were more like World War I style planes, and they were no match for modern fighters. They were manoeuvrable, but slow. The plane had 2 7.92mm machine guns, but its top speed was only 240 miles per hour, no match for the speed of the Bf-109. Most of the Polish planes would be destroyed on the ground. Those that did get airborne stood little chance against a faster Bf-109. The most fearsome aircraft the Germans had wasn't really a fighter at all, but a dive bomber, the Stuka. The Ju-87 had one purpose, to destroy ground targets, and it was utterly devastating at wiping out tanks. In the opening of the Polish campaign, these planes would strike from above and destroy all armoured vehicles with pinpoint dive bombing accuracy. The Germans even added a siren, so when the plane was diving, it would strike fear into the hearts of the enemy. The Stuka had a crew of 2, a pilot and a rear gunner, and although it was a great dive bomber, it was no match for modern fighters. The plane was 11 meters long, but its top speed was only 255 miles per hour, meaning it was vulnerable. Without an escort, it could easily be shot down by faster, more manoeuvrable fighter planes. Fortunately, the average Polish fighter planes weren't much faster than the Stuka dive bomber. The plane had 2 7.92mm forward-firing machine guns and 1 rear-firing machine gun. The Stuka dive bomber was almost like a piece of artillery that could come down from the air and drop bombs on surrounded enemy targets, destroying infantry, taking out tanks, and bombing anything that got in the Germans' path. It was a revolutionary weapon and perfect for the German blitzkrieg. Later versions would be fitted with heavy cannons to destroy tanks. The Heinkel HE-111 was one of the best German bombers during the Polish campaign. It had a crew of 5, a pilot and a navigator, who was also the bombardier and the nose gunner. There was also a dorsal gunner, a side gunner, and of course a radio operator. The plane was 16 metres long with a wingspan of 22 metres. The plane had a top speed of 270 miles per hour, and it could reach an altitude of 21,000 feet. The plane was equipped with 7 7.92mm machine guns. It also had a 20mm cannon and a 13mm cannon. It could also carry between 2,000 and 3,000 kilograms of bombs. As well as the Heinkel, the Germans also had the Dornier 17. These 2 bombers would be the backbone of the Luftwaffe. The Dornier was a twin-engine bomber with a crew of 4. It was 15.8 metres long with a wingspan of 18 metres. It had a top speed of 220 miles per hour. It also had 6 7.92mm guns. It could also carry 1,000 kilograms of bombs and could fly as high as 26,000 feet. The main German battle rifle was the 98K. It was powerful and robust. And by the start of the Second World War, this bolt-action rifle was one of the finest in the world. The rifle had an effective range of up to 500 metres, but fitted with a telescopic sight, it could increase that range to 800 to 1,000 metres. It was also loaded with a 5-round stripper clip and fired a 7.92mm round. The rifle was adopted by the military in 1935 and became one of the most advanced Mauser rifles ever made. Most German sections and platoons were made up of riflemen. Occasionally, one man would have a machine gun. In World War I, machine guns were heavy and cumbersome, but by the Second World War, they were lighter and more practical, and the MP40 was one of the finest machine guns in the world. It had an effective firing range of 100 to 200 metres, but had a high rate of fire, shooting out over 550 rounds a minute. It also had a 32-round detachable magazine. The bolt-action rifle was good for long-range targets, but was useless at close range against multiple enemies. That's why the MP40 was brought into service. It could kill men quickly and efficiently at close range, and put down a lot of firepower. The average German infantry platoon were armed with rifles, but at least 2 men were armed with the MP40 machine gun. This gave them a good variety of firepower. The rifles were effective from medium to long range, and the submachine guns were effective at close range against multiple targets. In World War I, Germany had the Maxim heavy machine gun. It was designed to suppress and support German attacks. However, in World War II, machine guns had become lighter and more practical and had a higher rate of fire. And one of the finest in the world was the MG34. With a 7.92mm round and a rate of fire of over 800 rounds per minute, this was one of the fastest firing machine guns in the world. It could literally cut down an entire attack. Hundreds of men could be killed by just one weapon firing across the battlefield. And unlike the heavy Maxim machine guns of World War I, the MG34 could be carried by one man into battle. The heavy machine gun could also be fitted to the top of a tank, so it could fire from the turret to clear off enemy troops. It was also used to support the infantry and suppress enemy attacks. The weapon could easily be deployed in order to suppress enemy units and keep their heads down whilst the Germans tried to flank positions. One of the most effective but simple German assault weapons was the stick grenade. It was just a simple stick with an explosive device attached to the top. The top of the stick was weighted so it made it easier to throw, and it was a very effective assault grenade. Unfortunately, it could be a bit cumbersome in the heat of battle because you had to unscrew the base and pull on the string to activate the detonator in order to throw the grenade. The grenade was often posted through a hole in the wall or thrown into a foxhole and designed to kill and eliminate enemy personnel. It was a great weapon for clearing out rooms and was used extensively to clean out buildings. The German troops would throw a grenade into a room, wait for it to explode, and then run in and kill any survivors. This process would be repeated until the building itself was completely clear of enemy troops. At times, men would have engaged in close hand-to-hand combat, beating men to death with the butts of rifles, stabbing them with knives, shooting them with sidearms. Many stories of brave men's last stands would never be told. The P08 German Luger pistol is the most iconic German sidearm of the Second World War. Yet, ironically, it wasn't the most used pistol. In fact, by 1942, the weapon had practically been replaced by the Walter P38. But the weapon would remain in service, being used by officers and other ranks. In the end, it became a prized item by Allied soldiers. Later on in the war, they wanted to find a Luger. It would become the ultimate souvenir. The Luger was an advanced looking weapon. It had an 8-round magazine and was fast and accurate. Its distinctive shape made it recognisable instantly. The pistol had initially been designed for World War I and been in service with the German army for a long time, but by World War II it was being phased out for a pistol that was cheaper to build. Its replacement would be the Walter P38. This would become the most widely used German sidearm in the Second World War. It too had an 8-round magazine and was similar in every way to the Luger's design, even had a similar rate of fire, although it didn't have the iconic look, and it was cheaper to make. The Polish army also had an excellent rifle, mainly because it was a direct copy of the German 98K with similar performance. The Karabinic 29 was an excellent Polish rifle. It copied the German design and it did the job. As well as copying the German rifle, the Polish also borrowed weapons from the Finnish army, including a rather unique looking machine gun. It was called the KP-31. After the success of the Thompson machine gun from America, many designs tried to copy it, and the KP-31 had an excellent rate of fire, being able to hit over 750 rounds per minute. Sadly, the Poles only had a small number of these weapons, so they couldn't really change the course of the battle. As well as copying the German rifle design, the Poles had also copied another famous gun, the American-made Browning automatic rifle. The Poles made their own version called the Browning WZ-1928 automatic rifle. It fired a 7.92mm round at 600 rounds per minute and was excellent for suppressing the enemy. Unfortunately, it only had a 20-round magazine. The Polish weapons were an assortment of borrowed weapons and stolen designs which had been reproduced, such as this Russian pistol which was based on a Russian design, but it was called the Nagant WZ-30. It was basically a powerful pistol which held 7 rounds and had good stopping power, but again it was taken from the Russian design and just reproduced. The Polish army were also equipped with heavy German machine guns from World War I, like the Maxim. They may have been out-of-date World War I machine guns, but they could still hit 500 rounds a minute. During the opening attack on Poland, the main invasion came from Army Group South. It was under the command of Colonel General Gerd von Rundstedt. He would attack from German Silesia and Slovakia. General Blaskewitz's 8th Army would drive eastward. They would move towards Lutz. The 14th Army would push towards Krakow and turn the Poles' Carpathian flank. And General Walter von Reichenauer's 10th Army, accompanied by Army Group South's armour, would attempt a northeastward thrust to carve up into Poland, delivering the decisive blow. The Poles were fighting a defensive battle. They were just trying to hold the border with their army groups. But when the time came, despite brave resistance, the German panzer units cut into the heart of Poland, driving towards the capital Warsaw. General Blaszkiewicz was so eager to take Warsaw that he moved too fast, and his first attack was repelled by the Polish army. This would lead to a Polish counterattack that would become the biggest battle of the campaign. Over 8,000 German soldiers would be killed and over 50 German tanks would be destroyed, but the Germans launched their own counter-offensive and killed over 20,000 Polish troops in the same battle. Eventually General von Rundstedt would take over command, and he was able to encircle the enemy force and destroy it. After fierce resistance, the Polish force was eventually defeated. Shortly after the German invasion on the 17th of September, the Russians also launched an invasion of Poland from the east, in conjunction with the German attack. The Russian army would capture a number of Polish soldiers and execute them. In the end, Poland never stood a chance. It was crushed between two different armies, the Germans on one side, the Russians on the other. In those German parts of the country that had been given to Poland after World War I, the Germans were welcome as liberators, especially in places like Danzig. Here the population was mainly Germans, and they were delighted to see the German army. They saw it as a liberation, not an invasion. But the German army didn't have time to celebrate. They had a battle to win, and soon they were pushing on towards Warsaw. The German army consisted of 2 million men. The Poles could only muster 1 million. The German army had 66 divisions, the Poles only 39. The Polish army had 210 tanks, the German army had 2,750 tanks. Plus the German army had many more tanks in reserve. Of course, most of them were the near obsolete Panzer Mark I and Panzer Mark II. However, they still had enough to overwhelm the Polish army. Adolf Hitler was so confident he even flew to Poland to celebrate with his troops. It wasn't long before the Russian army and the German army met each other. They'd both attacked Poland and they both wanted to carve up the spoils. However, this German-Russian alliance would not last for long. The leader of Russia, Joseph Stalin, had been fooled by Hitler. He didn't believe the Germans wanted to attack Russia, but he would soon be proved wrong, as the Germans prepared for their final assault on Warsaw itself. During the invasion of Poland, over 66,000 Polish soldiers would be killed. Over 133,000 would be seriously wounded, and over 675,000 would be taken prisoner by the German army. The Polish army had prepared for a World War I style battle. They were not prepared for the German speed and the German blitzkrieg. By the time their soldiers had dug a trench, the German tanks had already surrounded them. They just simply drove past obstacles, surrounded the Polish army, cut them off from their supplies and ammunition, and then hit them from daily attacks from Stuka dive bombers until they were blown to pieces or until they surrendered. In just over a month, the Germans had already surrounded the capital Warsaw and were hitting it with daily bombing campaigns. Radio Warsaw carried on broadcasting, trying to keep up the people's spirits. The people carried on, but they knew this battle was over. The war for Poland had been lost. It had only taken 35 days for the German army to crush the Polish resistance. The capital Warsaw held out the longest and put up a brave resistance, but it was only a matter of time. Daily bombing attacks from the Luftwaffe reduced much of the city to rubble. Great Britain and France declared war on Nazi Germany, but in the end there was very little they could do to help Poland. Poland was crushed between two great armies, the Russians on one side and the Germans on the other. They surrendered on the 6th of October 1939. Like Austria and Czechoslovakia, Poland would disappear from the map and become nothing more than part of the German Nazi Empire. It seems like Adolf Hitler had gambled and won again. He had defeated Poland and the German army looked invincible. Their new blitzkrieg or lightning war would strike fear into the hearts of their enemies. In Great Britain, Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain went on the radio to tell the British nation that Great Britain had declared war on Germany. After his speech, there was a test of the emergency air raid siren, which caused widespread panic. However, Great Britain's war would start slowly. Nothing would happen for months, and after a while, it became known as the Phony War. But soon the people of the country were digging bomb shelters and getting used to wearing gas masks and preparing for German bombing raids. Under Neville Chamberlain, the British government were divided. They argued about what to do and how to fight this war. As the months went by, Germany carried on invading Europe. On the 9th of April 1940, they invaded Denmark and Norway. Denmark and Norway had no standing armies, and both countries were quickly occupied. The Great British government under Neville Chamberlain had been caught napping once more. As they wasted time, Germany was taking over Europe. However, the British people were not eager to get involved in another world war. They still remembered the horrors of the First World War, and they were happy to waste time and prepare slowly before getting involved in any fighting. The French too were reluctant to take action, so Britain just sat back and slowly prepared for war and tried to enjoy the summer. Eventually at night a national blackout was declared to stop German bombers being able to see cities. Everyone had to turn out their lights. This caused a lot of accidents in the early months of the war. In fact, more casualties were caused in the blackout than there were by any actual fighting. Despite the slow start to the war, big decisions still had to be made. Many wanted to send their children away from the big cities to the countryside so they would be safe from German bombs. These children would become known as the evacuees. For many young children, it was an adventure and a chance to go to the country, a place they'd never seen before. For others, it was a heartbreaking experience leaving their family behind. As children left their mothers and fathers behind, the reality of war began to dawn on the people of Great Britain. For these young children, leaving their mothers and fathers behind was a heartbreaking and life-changing experience. And for some of them, they would never see their families again because they'd be killed by German bombs. For some of these children, this really was the last goodbye, the last time they would ever see their parents. Even though leaving their family was a heartbreaking experience, for many children it was a wonderful adventure in the countryside. Some had never seen a cow or a sheep before, so they had a great time. Britain had been slow to react to Hitler's invasion of Europe, but now they had full conscription. But there was no mad rush to join the recruitment office like there was in World War I. Men came forward, but they came forward in smaller numbers. They knew about the horrors of war, and none of them were keen to get themselves killed at such a young age. But they all knew, like their father in the First World War, they would be expected to do their duty in the Second. And many young men got married before they went off to fight for their country, just in case they never came back again. Men who weren't fit enough for frontline fighting duty could still serve their country as air raid wardens or in some other capacity. As Great Britain got used to war, it got used to the new blackout rules. The government even painted white lines on the streets and on corners so people could see where they were going in the dark. To stop German bombers being able to see cities, all lights at night had to be switched off, and these rules were strictly enforced. The people of Great Britain would pull together like never before. However, despite the war and despite the hardships, life went on, and the British people carried on celebrating it as best they could under the circumstances. The people of Great Britain rallied together, and with their bulldog fighting spirit, they were determined not to be beaten and not to be pushed around by Hitler and the Nazis. Unlike Great Britain, in Germany war production was at an all-time high. They were churning out more tanks and more fighter planes in preparation for the war to come. German war production would outstrip Great Britain at the start of the war, meaning the Germans had a massive advantage in equipment. The Germans had been preparing for war for a long time under the Nazis. When the first German plane crash-landed in Great Britain and the crew were killed, the people of Great Britain didn't know what to do. In the end, they gave the dead crew a burial with full military honours. Despite being at war with Germany and despite the hostilities, Britain still showed respect to their dead pilots. By early May in 1940, the British Expeditionary Force had over 390,000 troops in France, preparing and training, getting ready for war. The British troops would say goodbye to their families and loved ones and then board trains before heading to Dover, where they would board ships before sailing the Channel and arriving in France, ready for training. With an army of barely 400,000 men, the British knew they couldn't take on the Germans by themselves. The German army consisted of millions of men. The French had an army of millions of men. The British would help the French, but it would be the French that would have to do most of the fighting, whilst the British army built up its reserves. The Germans could deploy 3 million men to attack France. Great Britain had an army that was barely 400,000 men strong. The French had a larger army of millions, so they would have to hold the bulk of the German attack. It was a similar story to World War I, when the French had the biggest army and the British again had a small professional army. But by 1916 the British had built up an army of millions by conscription. This is what they were planning to do in World War II. But the French would have to stop the Germans, so the British would have time to build up their army. If the French couldn't stop the bulk of the German attack, Great Britain with its small army wouldn't stand a chance against 3 million Germans. The British army may not have been big, but it was well drilled and well disciplined, with many professional soldiers. The British army was strong and it could fight, and in World War I they pioneered the use of artillery and infantry support together with tanks. However, during the Second World War a lot of those lessons were forgotten. But not by the Germans. The French had a large army of millions of men, and fortunately they were still using the tactics of the First World War. They wanted to dig trenches and dig in and prepare for a defensive battle. Like in the First World War, the British and French army would move north into Belgium and dig a defensive line of trenches. That was the plan. However, the Germans wouldn't give them the time. During the Polish campaign, the German army had lost 17,000 men, with 30,000 being wounded. They'd also lost 236 tanks and 246 aircraft. But despite these losses, they were still more than a match for the British and French armies. Whilst the British and French trained and relaxed, the Germans had a plan. They were going to invade Holland and Belgium and force the French and British to march north to face the bulk of their army. Once they did, the Germans would then send a second army into the Ardennes, into France behind them. They would then cut round behind the British and French armies and race to the sea, cutting them off and surrounding the entire Allied forces. The British and French generals knew about the plan, but they didn't think the Germans would be able to get trucks and tanks through the Ardennes because it was a heavily forested region. Whilst the French and British generals sat around waiting for the German army to make its move, Churchill was more of a man of action. He believed, like Napoleon, that the army that stays behind its defences is already beaten. He wanted to take action. He wanted to try and liberate Norway. Churchill was the First Lord of the Admiralty, and he had the manpower to launch this operation. However, he was known for risky, daredevil adventures. Churchill was desperate to take the fight to the enemy. He wanted to launch a sea operation and sail ships to Norway, land, and attack and retake the country from the Germans. Great Britain had always been a naval power. They had one of the finest and most powerful navies in the world. But in June 1940, HMS Glorious, a British aircraft carrier, and 2 escorting destroyers were sunk by German U-boats. This sent shockwaves through the entire British nation. The sinking of aircraft carrier HMS Glorious shattered the myth of British naval invincibility. To make matters worse, the German pocket battleship, the Admiral Graf Spee, was sinking British merchant shipping in South American waters. This ship was considered such a threat that the British assembled a task force to find and sink it. At 5:30 in the morning on the 13th of December 1939, the Ajax, Exeter and Achilles engaged the German battleship Graf Spee in a firefight. The Graf Spee quickly outgunned the smaller British ships. The Exeter was hit 3 times. Both of its forward turrets were disabled and its bridge was destroyed. The Achilles and Ajax moved in an attempt to relieve pressure on the Exeter as they closed in on the Graf Spee. The HMS Exeter suffered 61 dead and 23 wounded. It withdrew from the battle but returned later, firing only from its rear turret. The HMS Ajax was also severely damaged, but in the end the Graf Spee was forced to retreat. The Graf Spee eventually escaped and managed to dock in Montevideo in Uruguay. But because Uruguay wasn't part of the war, the ship was only allowed to stay for 24 hours. The commander of the Graf Spee, Hans Langsdorff, was worried the British would be waiting for him outside the harbour. It was at this point the Great British Navy pulled off an incredible bluff. They convinced Langsdorff they had an entire fleet waiting to sink the Graf Spee as soon as it pulled out of Montevideo harbour. But this simply wasn't true. It was all a bluff. In fact, the Graf Spee could have easily escaped if they tried to, but the captain wasn't willing to risk his men's lives, so he offloaded his entire crew at Montevideo and decided to scuttle his own ship. Langsdorff believed he was doing the right thing. It was only later he realised he'd been fooled. After offloading his crew, the ship sailed out of Montevideo harbour, and scuttling charges were activated, blowing the ship up from within and sinking it. The whole world had expected a giant showdown between the German Navy and the British Royal Navy. They were expecting a gun battle, but instead the German ship simply sailed out of Montevideo and exploded. After realising he'd been fooled, Langsdorff shot himself. After the Battle of River Plate, the crews of Ajax, Achilles and Exeter sailed back to England for a hero's welcome. Churchill toasted the heroes, but Great Britain was under no illusion. They'd won this victory by bluff, but it was a victory. When Germany invaded Poland, the Russians joined forces with them. They also invaded Poland at the same time. They had made an alliance with the Germans, and now they wanted military bases in Finland. Finland refused, so the Russians invaded. On the 30th of November 1939, Russian troops moved into Finland. They also started bombing Helsinki. It was beginning to look like Great Britain and France would have to fight Germany and the Russians too. When Russia invaded Finland, everyone was expecting an overwhelming Russian victory, but it didn't happen. Joseph Stalin, the Russian leader, had killed so many of his own generals because he was so paranoid they were plotting against him. The Russian army was in disarray. Despite early success, the Russian-Finnish campaign would turn into an absolute disaster for the Russian army. The Finnish army was small, but what it lacked in size, it made up for in manoeuvrability. They had specialised units of ski troops that could get behind Russian lines, cutting off their supplies. The Finnish army were experts at winter warfare. They knew their own country, and they knew how to fight. In contrast, the Russian army was in disarray. They suffered from poor morale and poor leadership. Because of Stalin killing all their generals, they really had no one to lead them, and they had no experienced commanders. The Russian attack ground to a halt, and entire Russian divisions were destroyed as the Finnish exploited their country and their terrain to their advantage. The Russian army started to surrender in large numbers. Those that didn't surrender froze to death in the snow. The Finnish campaign had proven to the Germans that the Russian army was no longer a fit fighting force, that Stalin had executed all their commanders, and now they were nothing more than a rabble of men. The Russian army had been demoralised, defeated and humiliated, and the Germans watched on, realising the Russian army was weak. Eventually, Finland itself would become a German ally in the Second World War. But after their failed campaign, all the Russian army had to show for their advance was a pile of frozen Russian corpses. The disastrous Russian attack on Finland had proved to Hitler and the Nazis just what they always believed, that the Russians were not fit to fight, that they were inferior fighting men and no match for the Germans. In the winter of 1939, as the year began to end and 1940 began, Britain considered its next move, the invasion of Norway. Norway was very strategic because that's where the Germans got all their iron ore from. If Norway could be retaken by the Allies, it would be a serious blow to Adolf Hitler. Retaking Norway would be key for all kinds of strategic purposes, but the idea may have been sound in theory, but in practice it would be very difficult for the British to land and take back Norway, especially as they had no professional ski-trained troops. At one point the British even entered Norwegian waters and captured the supply ship Altmark. After a fierce firefight, the British managed to capture the German vessel and release over 300 British prisoners. Hitler feared the Royal Navy, and he began to plan for a defensive campaign in Norway in case the British and French tried to liberate the country. It was Winston Churchill pushing for the attack on Norway. However, many MPs remembered his failed Gallipoli campaign in World War I, and they were fearful that this would turn into another British disaster. However, Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain was under pressure to take action against the Germans as soon as possible. Most of the British army were tied up in France. However, this would be an opportunity for the British to test their mettle against the Germans. Churchill was popular, but many MPs still remembered the failed Gallipoli campaign, and they saw Churchill as a reckless maverick, and they weren't sure about the Norwegian operation. But in the end, Churchill got his way. However, for Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, a Norwegian disaster could have been the end of his career. He looked like the man who failed to appease Hitler. If Britain lost in Norway, he would probably have to resign. As Britain prepared for its Norwegian campaign, the Russians, after their humiliating defeat in Finland, decided to attack them again, this time bringing their entire army. They eventually overwhelmed and crushed the Finnish troops, avenging their defeat. Finland had been defeated finally, and they were forced to surrender to the Russians and let them have the bases that they wanted. Despite all the talk of Nazi German aggression, the Russians were just as bad, trying to carve out their own empire. They'd invaded East Poland and occupied it, and now they'd invaded Finland. They were becoming just as big a threat as the Nazis were to the French and British. But Stalin and the Russians had a shock coming, because Germany had plans of their own. In the meantime, the Royal Navy began mining Norwegian waters as they prepared for their Norwegian campaign. On the 6th of April 1940, the German army had invaded Norway. They'd occupied all major cities and all major airfields. In the First World War, the battleship was king. Nothing could match it. But by World War II, the aeroplane had become superior. Air power was superior to naval power. And this was a lesson the British would learn in the Norwegian campaign. Like the people of Poland, the people of Denmark, the people of Norway had to get used to watching German soldiers marching through their streets. And they would for a long time. But like Czechoslovakia and Poland, the people of Norway would resist any way they could, and small groups of resistance units would fight back against the Germans bravely and against the odds. From the very beginning, the Norwegian campaign was a mess. British and French troops lacked proper cold weather gear, some troops lacked ammunition, everything was disorganised, supplies were missing, and the men just weren't properly ready or prepared for the conditions they would face in Norway. The task force would consist of French troops, British troops, and Norwegian troops. Their main objective was to seize Trondheim in Norway, and to do this they would land in other areas such as Narvik. The big guns of the Royal Navy ships would support the landings of the Allied troops. However, the Germans had full air superiority, and their planes would be able to hit the landing zones and attack British ships. In early April, the Royal Navy, with its Allied contingent, set sail to retake Norway. The Germans had occupied Norway days earlier. The German Navy had attacked Trondheim and Narvik and established bridgeheads and taken control of the entire country. They'd also used their new paratroopers to seize control of the capital Oslo. The entire invasion was over in just 6 hours. The Allied plan was to retake Narvik and recapture Trondheim. When the Royal Navy ships arrived, they caught the German fleet completely by surprise. HMS Hardy, HMS Havoc and HMS Hunter engaged 3 German destroyers. They opened fire, sinking 2 and disabling 1. They also sunk a number of supply ships and a number of tankers. The Royal Navy had won the opening battle. Later, 2 more German ships would be sunk, including one by a British submarine. After destroying the German fleet, the British began bombarding Narvik itself, attacking German targets. The ships that attacked Narvik had no troops to land, so eventually the captain ordered an attack on the last remaining German ships. Unfortunately, HMS Hardy was hit and Captain Warburton Lee was killed. Later on, 3 more German destroyers turned up, and HMS Hunter was sunk by torpedoes as the British were forced to retreat. The main British landings would take place on the 12th of April around Andelsnes. Other landings would take place near Trondheim itself. Some British troops got ashore but were immediately pinned down by elite German ski troopers with sniper rifles. The British didn't have the equipment necessary for a campaign like this. The British had no skis, bad maps and no heavy artillery, but the Germans, they had artillery, and they pounded the British landing positions. Without heavy artillery, the British were at a real disadvantage against the German troops defending Norway. The British may have had ships, but with no artillery and air support, they were at a real disadvantage against the German army. The fact was, the German army had got to Norway first. They dug in and defended their position well. They had artillery and air support, and the attacking British force was severely outgunned. A lot of Norway was covered in snow, and the best way to operate was with ski troops. Unfortunately, the British had no ski equipment. This gave them a massive disadvantage, because the Germans had skis. This made the Germans quicker and more mobile on the battlefield. The main British infantry rifle was the Lee Enfield Mark I. It was fast and powerful, and one of the finest rifles in the world. The weapon fired a .303 round and had an effective range up to 500 metres. The British infantry would use a tactic called the Mad Minute, where they would fire as many rounds as possible in 60 seconds. Armed with the Lee Enfield, a British infantry platoon could put down so much firepower that sometimes enemies thought they were under attack by machine guns. Versions of the short magazine Lee Enfield would be used in World War I, World War II and right up to 1957. It was a highly effective and powerful rifle. A good infantry soldier armed with the Lee Enfield had a firing rate of 30 rounds a minute. The Lee Enfield also had a 10-round magazine, which also made it highly effective. It could also be fitted with a bayonet, which made it a superb and deadly hand-to-hand combat weapon in the hands of a British soldier. The British Army were also armed with a Bren light machine gun. It had a 30-round magazine and fired a .303 round. The Bren had a rate of fire of 500 rounds a minute. The Bren gun was also surprisingly accurate and had a maximum effective range of up to 500 metres. It may not have been as fast firing as the MG34, but it packed a punch. It could also be carried into combat by one man, who could fire it from the hip and use it as a light support weapon to keep the enemy pinned down. The Bren gun would become an iconic and deadly weapon in the hands of a British infantry soldier. The main sidearm of the British Army was the Webley revolver. It could fire 6 rounds and had been in service since 1887. It saw action in World War I and in World War II. It was a powerful revolver that packed a punch. It would become an iconic weapon carried by British officers in the Second World War. It may not have been as fast as a pistol, and it only had 6 rounds, but it became an iconic, effective weapon. Unlike the German stick grenade, the British used the Mills bomb. It was small and practical and had square panels on the outside so it could fit into the palm of the hand and was easy to grip. It had a 4-second fuse and was easy to use. All you had to do was pull the pin and throw, and it was perfect for clearing out enemy foxholes. The British Mills bomb was far more effective than the German stick grenade and far more practical. With poor maps, no skis, no air cover and no artillery, it wasn't long before British prisoners started being taken. The whole Norway campaign had degenerated into a farce. The Germans suffered 5,296 casualties during the battle. 1,317 German soldiers had been killed, 2,375 sailors were lost at sea. They also had 1,604 wounded men. They'd also lost 1 heavy cruiser, 2 light cruisers, 10 destroyers and 6 U-boats. They'd also lost 21 merchant ships. The British had suffered 6,602 casualties. 1,869 British men had been killed, wounded or were missing. At sea, the British had lost over 2,500 men. They'd also lost 1 aircraft carrier, 2 cruisers, 7 destroyers and a submarine, plus 115 aircraft, and the Germans kept bombing the British naval ships as they retreated from Narvik and Norway. The British learnt a valuable lesson in Norway. They began to realise that naval power was no match for air power. Many British ships were sunk on the way home by Stuka dive bombers. The French also lost 2 destroyers and 2 submarines and had over 530 casualties during the battle. The Norwegian army also had 1,700 casualties, with 860 men being killed. 530 civilians were also killed in the fighting in Norway. The fighting was fierce, and the German army and the Allies both suffered significant casualties during the fighting. But in the end, Germany remained in control of Norway, and the British ships returned home. As soon as the troops disembarked from the ships, questions were being asked about why the Norwegian campaign was such a failure. The lack of artillery support, the lack of air support, the bad maps, the lack of ski equipment, all these things could not be overlooked. Neville Chamberlain was a great statesman, but he wasn't a war leader. Britain needed a man to lead them to victory, and Prime Minister Chamberlain looked like a weak man. He'd failed to appease Hitler, he'd failed to stop the invasion of Poland, and even the Norwegian campaign had been a dismal failure. And now members of his own party were beginning to turn against him and wanting him to stand down as Prime Minister. Prominent and experienced politicians like Lloyd George demanded that Prime Minister Chamberlain stand down and resign. Chamberlain would go, but the question was, who would replace him? Who would be the next Prime Minister of Great Britain? Who could lead them to victory? Lord Halifax was the man everybody wanted. He was a great statesman and a brilliant politician. But was he a war leader? And did he even want to be Prime Minister? One man who did want to be Prime Minister was Winston Churchill, but he wasn't the popular choice. A lot of members of the Parliament were against him, mainly because of the failures of military campaigns in the past, like Gallipoli in World War I, and like the recent Norwegian failure. It soon became apparent the 2 front-runners to become the next Prime Minister were Churchill and Halifax. However, it seemed like Halifax didn't want the job, which left Churchill as the only obvious choice. Halifax was seen as a safe pair of hands, and Churchill was seen as a maverick. But either way, Great Britain didn't have long to choose a new leader, as Germany invaded Holland, Luxembourg and Belgium. Germany was invading the whole of Europe, and Great Britain and France had to act, and soon. And Great Britain needed a new Prime Minister. And reluctantly, Winston Churchill was given the job. When Halifax pulled out, the King of England sent for Winston Churchill to make him the new Prime Minister. It would become obvious that he would be the man to lead Great Britain through its darkest hour.